Hello everyone, this is Marty, and I'm going to try to walk you through my process for capturing images of the sun in hydrogen alpha wavelength. To start out, I'm going to show you what I'm using for this particular demo. I'm using an Orion short tube 80mm achromatic refractor. I left the main lens cap on, but I took the inner cap off, reducing the aperture to about 42mm. This brings my focal ratio to about f9.5. This plays a lot nicer for sampling with my quark. The quark is what I am using as a hydrogen alpha filter. I am on an Orion Sirius mount, and I am using an ASI 174 mono camera to capture the data. The video will involve what I do to acquire the data, and what I do to align the videos, and how I process the output of those videos to get a final image. The final image we're going to work towards is this one. This is the large prominence making an arc today on May 8th of 2017. So from here we'll move on to how we acquire the data. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to load up SharpCap and take a look at the exposure settings and how we capture things. When it first loads up, there's default settings that it goes to. As you can see, I'm already on the disk and we're looking at it, and if you look over to the right, this is really where all the exposure values are. Right now I want you to look up here where it says zoom. We're at 50%. That way I'm looking at 50% of the total field of view, crunched down basically, so I can see the whole thing. We want to capture in 8-bit mono. There's no reason to capture in a higher of anything. No raw, no none of that. This particular camera can go a little higher on the bit depth, but we don't need to. Binning, I'm not going to use any at all. If you wanted to increase FPS, you could bin a little bit, such as 2x2. I'm going to keep the full capture area. Region of interest would drop this value to other lower resolution values, and that would also speed up your FPS. I'm going to output to AVI, and I do not want to use anything automatic. Exposure, you'll see it here in milliseconds. Gain, that's what you'll use to adjust exposure after that. And I don't touch anything on USB or any of that, and I leave my gamma at 1 and brightness at 1 when it comes to the surface. I do things differently for prominences. So to start out, I typically use a 10 millisecond exposure value. So as you can see, that immediately brings things in to be seen. I can see the surface. I'm already kind of focused. Down here I'm clipping off. Over here is space. I'm going to use my histogram to kind of get an idea of where I should be. This little icon here brings up the histogram. Notice on the far right the data keeps going, it clips off, so I know that I'm overexposing. That tells me I need to reduce my gain. So I'm going to reduce my gain a little bit and take a look. And now I see a nice curve that lands in the middle, stopping around 70%. I could probably go a little higher. The goal is to have this data set here not clip off to the right, otherwise you lose information. Let's try another value. Now we're around 80%, 90%. We're not clipping off completely. I like that histogram. I'm happy where that's going, so I'm going to stay with there. So for my surface, I'm looking at 10 milliseconds, 70 gain, and minimum gamma. That's a good place for me to start. From there you can change it to something else. Right now I want to work on my focus, so I'm going to zoom, and I'm going to go to 100%. I'm going to take a look at this particular surface feature right here and see if I can't rack focus in and out and get slightly better focus than what I'm looking at. And I'm gonna stop there, let it settle and take a peek. As long as I see something like what looks like a pencil sketch for just a moment, I know I'm focused enough to work with it. So I'm happy enough with where that is right now. Now let's go ahead and change our zoom back to 50% so we can see everything. And I'm going to look for something interesting. I know that there's a big prominence. We're going to try to image that real quick. So to see the prominences, I need to use a very different exposure value. I'm going to increase gain a lot and gamma a lot to do that. So before we do that, we want to remember exposure length of 10 milliseconds, gain of 70, gamma 1. That's going to be our surface for this particular setup. Now I'm going to change my gamma to 99. I want to max it out. Notice everything gets very bright, brings up the midtones. And I'm going to take the gain up really high as well, something like 200, just to start looking around. And now I know I've clipped off some data, but that's okay. Now I'm going to search around the limb of the disc with my mount and look for something to image, like a prominence. You can see a few little prominences right there. Nothing over here yet. Looks like a couple down there. And there's the big prominence right there, lower left. We're going to try to image that. So I'm just going to leave my field of view where it is right now and work with this. Here I find that the histogram doesn't help very much. Here I just use enough values to get exposure on the prominence itself, and I don't worry about clipping data on the disk. Notice my disk is not perfect. I have some overlap over here. That's because my sensor is not perfectly square to my filter. But that's okay. I can work with that. I'm going to play with the gain again just to see if I can get a little bit more. Now I can really see that prominence. I'll go to 100% just so we can look at it. There it is. Nice big prominence. And you can see the little fingers along the edge of the disc, and I'm overexposing the disc itself tremendously, but that's okay. Here I'm kind of coming over again. That's due to tilt. That's okay. We can live with that. So I kind of like where I am right now. I have exposure hitting the limb of the disc. I can see plenty of the prominence. We can go ahead and capture this. I'm at 10 milliseconds, gain of 240, and gamma is maxed out. I'm going to grab a few frames. I'm just going to grab 500 frames, for example, noted right here. You'll see the progress lower right. You can see my FPS here. You'll have to forgive me, it's not moving as quickly as normal because I'm recording all of this. We're almost finished and done. So while I'm still here without changing my field of view, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my surface values. If you recall, that was 70 and gamma of 1. There's my surface again that I originally started with. And I'm going to capture that as well, another 500 frames. Again, you can see the progress lower right. And again, you'll forgive how slow it's moving simply because I'm recording this. Notice I did not change field of view or move the scope or anything. I'm gathering two videos, one for the surface, one for the prominences. All done. We have both sets of data. There's one more step that I include, and that's flat frame calibration. I'm not going to do it here. I'm actually going to move the scope now. and it's going to involve changing focus, but I want to keep the same exposure as the surface. So I'm going to keep 10 milliseconds, 70 gain, and 1 gamma. But I'm going to move the scope to the center of the disc, or just somewhere where I mostly have the disc, so that I can get illumination of my image train. So that's a good spot. You can see lower right it's a little brighter, top left a little darker, and that's okay. You can see the dust bunnies right around here and here and here, some larger ones. There's probably some rings involved, but that's okay. That's what flat calibration is all about. So to do this, I'm actually going to defocus. So while I'm right here, I'm going to just rack the focus in until it's completely gone, and it should just be a big blur of gray. There we are. As you can see, all the little things, all the blemishes are remaining there because they're actually in the imaging train, but the disc itself is out of focus. That way I don't harm any of my details. I'm going to keep the same exposure values as the surface. Now I'm going to capture some video of just this. I'm going to go to capture, start capture. I generally capture about 300 frames of this. I'm going to hit start. This video will be used to create a single flat frame image that will calibrate the surface video to get rid of all the dust bunnies and stuff and flatten out basically the gradients of brightness to darkness. And that's it. That's how I capture the prominence, the surface, and a flat frame to then calibrate the videos to. In the next video we will go to edit these and create a final image. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Now that we have our data and I've transferred it to my workstation in my house, we're going to take a look at it and see what we have. Here are the 3 videos that we just created with our data acquisition. The first video was that of the prominence, the second video that of the surface detail, and the third video was the defocused flat frame that we use for calibration. I like to just take a look at them real quick to see how they appear. Looks like I have a decent amount of information. There was a smaller prominence there too, that's great. Let's look at the surface. Looks like I can see the surface everywhere. Notice the little dust bunnies and specks, those are what we're going to clean up. And finally the flat frame, defocused, but you can see everything that needs to be cleaned up on the other images, all the little blemishes and dust, and very specifically these gradients of dark to light. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to use Autostakkert, and I'll walk you through real quick. I'm going to click open. We're going to start with our flat frame. So I take the flat frame video and I open it. Notice you can see everything going on. There's a red square box, but we don't need to do anything with it right now. All we're going to do is use this video to create a flat frame. So without changing any settings, I simply go to image calibration, create master flame, and I'm just going to call it my flat. Click save, and it will process and go through normally. The whole point of making this frame is to calibrate the surface video. So it's complete, and now I'm going to open the surface video. This time we are going to change a few things. So here under zoom, I'm going to change it down a little bit so that I can just see it. 60%, whatever works for you. And there's really no major surface feature that I want to focus on, so I can really just leave this red box as an anchor anywhere right now. If you wanted to move it around, simply follow the directions, control click, and it moves around. I'm going to leave it right there for now. Let's take a look at actual settings in SharpCap. I'm going to use surface. I'm going to use improved tracking with expansion. I'm not going to change these values, and I'm simply going to click analyze. But before I do that, I want to calibrate this image. I want you to see what flat frame calibration does. So before we move forward, I go to image calibration, load master flat. Select the flat image that we created from the other video, and it'll be applied. Notice the blemishes go away, the gradient smooths out, and I get a flat image for the most part. That's what the point is of using flat frame calibration. Cleans up everything very nicely, very easily. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and click Analyze, and let SharpCap take a look, pick out the best frames, and we'll go from there. It's analyzed and it's picked out some frames, and here we can look at everything. The next part is we need to pick alignment points. So here you can see the alignment point controls within this display. You can use smaller points and you can use very large points. Because the image scale here is small and my field of view is small and overall the resolution is small, I'm going to use a smaller alignment point set. So I'm just going to use the preset 24, and I'm going to let it use a minimum brightness of 20 so that it just grabs everything including the disk and ignores all this black space. And I'm going to click place the grid. It'll do it automatically, and I have a ton of points, 7,000 plus. I don't really need that, so I'm actually going to clear it, and I'm going to increase the size of my alignment point, 32 this time. And I'm going to do the placement again. This time I have 4,000 points. I like that better. It will process faster, and it won't be much different. You can see the size here and how they overlap. That's all we need to do here. So back to this screen. The next part, under stack options, if you look through, I want the output to be a TIFF, and I can use the number of frames or I can use the percentage of frames. This particular video is 500 frames. If I did 10%, I would get 50, or I can just set how many I want. In this case, I'm going to just stack 50 of the best frames out of all 500. That's about 10%. I do not want to sharpen it. I do not want to do any of the other values right now. I don't want to use drizzle. If you wanted to increase the size or resolution after in post, you could use drizzle, but I don't want to right now. So I'm going to just click stack. Notice under information it says flat being used right there. That's important because in the next series we're going to remove the flat because we don't want it. We only want it on the surface where you can actually see the blemishes. Other videos, such as the prominence video, we won't see any of those blemishes, and so we do not need the flat frame. So we will remove that on the next one. And we are complete. Next, I want to open up my prominence video. So here we are. Notice you can see the blemishes and a strong gradient. That's because the flat frame calibration is being applied to this, but we want to turn that off. So I'm going to go to Image Calibration, clear the loaded flat. There. Now you no longer see it here under information, and when we look at our actual screen, we don't see any of that information anymore. We just see the original video, and that's fine. Here I'm going to move the anchor, so control click, and I'm going to move it to approximate this structure, this large prominence that I want to focus on. And for the next part we're going to analyze it just like before. So surface, improved tracking with expansion, not going to change anything else, and I'm going to analyze it. The next part actually takes a little work on your part. We are not going to use automatic placement of alignment points. Instead, we are going to manually press in some alignment points. I tend to like to just click the limb of the surface and make a large blanket over the prominences, and that way it focuses only there and ignores everything else. The disc itself is completely overexposed. Please ignore the lines and everything. That's just some kind of problem with my camera, but that won't really matter here. I'm going to use the same alignment point size as before. You can use any other value, whatever works for you. But I'm not going to automatically place a grid. It doesn't really have a very good means of placing it automatically when it comes to the prominences, simply because of the exposed disc being completely clipped out. So what I do is I simply quickly place lots and lots and lots of little alignment points along the limb of the disc. That way I know that it will focus on only these areas and align only these areas and ignore the overexposed disc itself, and for the most part ignore all of the empty space as well. And then I'm going to go back and continue to place more over areas where I saw other information, just to be safe, as well as this large prominence that we were focusing on to begin with. You can be very generous, cover it completely. This is what we want to align and stack. If you are very concerned with noise, you can go ahead and put more alignment points out into the dark space, but I generally don't. That's up to you, personal preference. I like to get a little extra overlap over the limb just to make sure there aren't any really faint prominences poking through. And that's it for manual alignment point placement, and I now go back to here, and for stacking options, again I'm using TIFF. I just want to get 50 of my frames out of 500, and I'm not going to change any of these values. I'm simply going to click stack. And it's finished. I'm going to go ahead and close Autostakkert and just take a look at the results of our data. Here's our original videos and our flat frame that we created, and here are the outputs of Autostakkert. We have the surface and we have the prominence. The next step is to process these. So we'll do that on the next video. Now that we have our data acquired and we've aligned and stacked and calibrated the data, and we have 3 images left over, we're only going to process, of course, prominence and surface. The first thing I like to do when I begin processing is I use Registack 6 for wavelets. Here I'm going to select the prominence image we created. I don't have any specific settings or anything selected, and I'm going to focus on this area here. By double clicking the area, I can now focus here when I change some values. Over here you'll notice all the little wavelets. I like to begin with the 3rd bar, and I push it rather hard at first to take a look, and you'll get a preview. You do not want to over sharpen. You want to sharpen just enough to get some definition. Let's do the final sharpening in other software. So in this case, I'm going to back off a little bit. Still kind of soft, not too much noise. I'm okay with that. I'm going to go up to the second bar, give it just a kiss. Again, I don't see any odd artifacts, no really hard lines, that's okay. And I'm going to go down to this fourth line, push it a little bit, no hard lines, no artifact. Fifth line, starting to get some definition, but no hard lines and no artifacts. And the last one, number 6, that seems to look okay. I'm going to look here as well by double clicking, and as you can see, it really kind of popped out, but you don't see really hard noise patterns. You'll know you've gone too far because you'll see little snowballs that get bigger and bigger as you over sharpen. I can see I have some grain and some noise, but that's okay. I like where this is, so I'm simply going to click Save Image. After I do the Do All function that it's prompting me to do, so I will do all. Normally you would click right here, and it will go through the entire image and apply those settings. It's all finished. It's going to prompt me what do I want to save it as. I'm simply going to add a little value to the end, R6, just to denote that this was the sharpened version. Click Save. I'm going to select the next image, the surface image, and load it up. Alright, we don't have any specific features or structures that we want to focus on, so I'm just going to look right here in the middle of the disk, double click, that way I'm focusing here, and again back to the wavelets. I'm going to begin with the middle one, number 3, push it kind of hard, and take a look. You can see right away a little more definition, looks kind of like a pencil sketch. That's kind of what we want. I'm going to back off a little bit, maybe a little too far back, push it again. Again, we don't want to over sharpen, we just want to start here. I'll stick with that. We'll move to the next one, see what that does. Further defined, top one, further defined. This lower one here, too far. Come back down. Still some definition, not over the top. Let's try number 5. Too far. I'm going to back it back down. That looks okay. And the last one, number 6. And we'll leave it alone. This doesn't look very sharp, but again, that's okay. We do not want to over sharpen. You do not want your final sharpened appearance to be done in this software. Click Do All, and it will apply that to all of it. And we can take a quick look at what we have. I can see all the different little features and spicules. I like that, so I'm going to click Save Image. And again, I'll add a little bit at the end just to denote that this is the waveletted version, and save it. I am done with Registack, so I'm going to close that. Next, we're going to bring our 2 images into Photoshop. You can use other software, of course, such as GIMP or something else, whatever you have. I'm going to open only the 2 that I applied the wavelets to at the same time. So here I've selected both my prominence and my surface images that have the wavelets applied. So here's the surface with wavelets, and here's the prominence with wavelets. You can see there's a lot of artifact and other things. You may or may not have stuff like this, depends on your camera and your setup. My camera happens to do this when I overexpose, but that's okay. It doesn't matter as long as it's not in the data that I want to keep. I like to start with the prominence layer. So here the first thing I'm going to do is clean up this overexposed disk. And I do that simply by painting it away. And I paint it white. So here I'm going to select white. You could sample, or you could just select white. and I use a large hard brush and I simply paint away all of that stuff. And I'll use a smaller one as I get closer to the limb to do that a little better. So here, for example, let's check this out. Go over to that side and work on it a little bit. Go back to our brush and paint it away. Okay, now it's time for a smaller brush, and I'll get closer and closer and closer and clean all of this up. It actually doesn't have to be perfect. I just like to get some of the things out of there. Again, a lot of this you're looking at is artifact, and you may not have this with your setup, I hope. I have to go through this extra little step just because of how mine works. So hopefully yours is easier. I use a smaller and smaller brush just to clean up and get rid of everything here. There's no data to preserve on the disk itself. The only thing we're going to keep really is the actual prominences and any other features that you might want to keep. So again, we're simply painting it all away and making it white all the way to the limb. And as you can see, I'm not being particularly careful. Just enough to get rid of it. Alright, and I'm going to back out. There, I missed a little spot. Alright, that's it. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start working with the image itself. The first thing I like to do is start with a levels adjustment. And I like to look at the histogram. Over here, the data on the left would be where the black is. Over on the right, the white. You can see little bits of data here. That would be the little black that there is. Here's the actual disk and limb and everything. All the little bits and pieces with data, such as the prominence, exist here. The disk itself, where it's overexposed, is this white blotch way over here, which we don't need. I like to start by pulling in my blacks a little bit. So I bring this value to the right, but I pay attention to my prominences so that I don't lose the data. Here all the data is starting to come into the prominence. So if I clip past it, notice you lose a lot of the glow out here, but you retain your prominences because the data for them is here. So this is personal preference. You can get as tight as you want with this. I like to keep a little glow just because it looks nicer to me. Again, personal preference. I can still see my prominence fairly well, so I'm going to leave it there. Here on the right, we can pull in our white as well, and I'll show you what it looks like. It really starts to brighten things up. Notice when it overexposes, it expands. We do not want that. So I'm going to bring it back. And I'm going to clip out that really hard white right there, just enough, and leave it there. I like that. I can still see both prominences fairly well. I can see the edge of the disk fairly well. And the next thing I'm going to do is apply a contrast adjustment. Again, I'm just going to move the slider just to take a preview and see what it looks like as I apply heavy contrast. Too much contrast and you can see I start to lose the wispiness in my prominences, so I may only use a very small amount, just a touch. Looks like that's okay to me, and I will leave that there. The last thing I want to do to this is I like to finalize the sharpening of my prominences separate from the rest of the image. So I'm going to flatten all of these layers, and I'm going to make a duplicate layer. And this layer, I'm going to change this blending mode to soft light. Now I'm going to go to Filter, Other, High Pass. and you'll see the preview, but I like to start around 30 pixels or so, 40 pixels, and just play with it. Take a look at the preview. Too much and you can see you lose some of the wispiness, too little and it doesn't seem to do much. So just play around in the middle and find something that works for you. I think that looks okay, so I'll hit OK. And I like to blend it a little bit, so I'm going to change the opacity to 80 and I'm going to flatten the image. So to show you what that looks like, we'll come in and take a peek. So you can see the wispiness of the different prominences, and there's some here along the surface as well, little bits of data. No artifacts, not over sharpened, no hard edges, and nothing stark white within the prominences. You do not want there to be any extremely bright whites within your prominences. That will look a little less natural. The disc is okay to be stark white. We're not going to be using it anyway. So the next step of our prominences is I actually resize it. When you overexpose, it actually blooms a little bit. The disc will appear larger. So I will go to image size, and I change from pixels to percentage. I simply I use something like 99%. Just a little bit smaller. I don't use any actual pixels, I just change the percentage. I like about 99%. It shrinks just a little bit. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to select all, copy. We're now going to take this prominence image and we're going to put it as a layer on top of our surface image. So here's our surface image. I'm going to go to paste and it will paste over as a new layer. So you can see layer 1 and the background right there. And I can use the eyeball to show you what's underneath it back and forth. To align them together, I just simply change the layer blending mode to difference on the prominence layer. So now you can see as I move it around, I hold the control key and the mouse and I move it around. I can see through it, I can see the disc, and I can line them up. So you can see if I go too tight, there's a black shadow. If I'm not on the disc, there's a big white halo. So I try to get in as tight as I can. You can use the arrow keys to nudge it around. If you leave a lot of the white halo, that will show up later when you go to color it as a very, very bright white, or you can go for whatever works for you. Just play around and see what looks good to you. I like that. I don't see too much of the disc or the prominence. They seem to be blended close enough, so I'll leave it there. I'm going to turn off that layer for just a moment by clicking the eye on the prominence layer. I like where it's at and I'm just going to leave it alone, but I want to work on the surface. So on the surface, I'm going to start by making a levels adjustment, just like before. Looking at this histogram, again, you can see there's a blip of data on the far left, and that would be your blackest point. There's no data on the far right, nothing is clipping white. That's good. I start by bringing in the black, and you can see I'm bringing it a little closer, a little more, right about there. I don't want to clip the data away here, and I don't want to bring it in to the actual data here. And I'm going to drag the white down until I get closer and closer to my data points that start showing up here in this small area. Notice there's a spot that has some clipping, but that's okay. We're going to crop that out later. Overall, I'm just looking at the majority of the disk, and I can bring it in more just to show you how that looks. That's way too much. Stop right there. So again, you can see I've simply bracketed in the data and the histogram where I'm here to here and ignoring everything outside of those brackets. This middle value you can use to change as well. If I pull it to the left, it looks like it gets brighter, but you lose a lot of contrast. to the right and I get more contrast, but it gets darker. I like to push it a little bit to the right for that additional contrast. Just a little bit. So I like that. I'm going to leave that there. The next thing we want to do is combine these two. So I'm going to take levels and I'm going to also select my surface layer by holding Control and selecting both. I'm going to right click and I'm going to merge just those layers. This does not include the prominence layer. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, right click, duplicate, and now I have a copy of it. I'm going to change the blending mode to soft light. Notice it gets a little different, and we're going to go to Filter, Other, High Pass. Preview it while we work, look at the pixel values, and I'll push it close to 40, maybe down into the 30s. I like that a little better, not too much. So it's a little sharper there. You can preview on and off, and I'll stick with that. I like to blend it, so opacity, I'll choose 80%, and I will select both layers again. Note that I'm not including the prominence layer, and I'm going to merge those layers again. Once more, I'm going to duplicate the layer, change the blending mode to soft light, filter, other, high pass, and I'm going to do a little bit of a softer sharpen this time. 20 looks okay, and again, opacity 80%, select those two layers, merge layers. Now you can see what my disc looks like now on the surface. It's a lot more contrast. Nothing is specifically black and nothing is bright white. Now I'm going to reveal the prominence layer just so we can see what it looks like together. So again, my prominence layer, the blending mode is on difference. I like that because it looks inverted, but I just wanted to see overall what it's going to look like. Here on the limb, it's a little too bright. So I might want to drop exposure just a little bit there, but we'll wait until it's colored to really see. But overall, I kind of like what I'm looking at. I'm going to disable the prominence layer again, and I want to work on this a little bit more. I'm going to give it a little contrast by clicking right here and getting a contrast adjustment. I'm going to push contrast a little more, not too much, maybe right about there. I'm going to make sure I keep it down here with that. The next thing I want to do is I want to duplicate layer again of only the surface, and I want to take a look at Filter, Sharpen, Unsharpen Mask. I use this as the final sharpening, and I look at the preview here. I'm working at just 1 pixel, and I adjust the percentage. I want to get a little sharper, but not so much to where it looks really hard with a lot of little snowballs and bits and pieces of noise. Somewhere in the middle, somewhere where it's still a little soft, but a little more defined. I like about there, that looks okay. Click OK. I'm going to blend it 80%, and I'm going to select these layers, the brightness, the sharpening layer, and the last layer, and merge those again. I'm going to re-enable my prominence layer just to look at it. Looks good to me. Take a look at both sides. That looks okay too. It's a little bright at the limb, but that's alright. We'll see how that looks. You can see I have some problems here and this border. I'm going to crop all this away. So I'm going to use the selection box, and I'm just going to create a composition out of this disc that I think is decent. In this case, I'm going to use rule of thirds and put the large prominence features in the lower left so that it's approximately 1/3 of the image, keep some of the disc, and enough room for the void. I think that looks okay, and I'm going to go to Image, Crop. And so this is my image now. Notice everything blends in together. All we have left to do is to further sharpen or color. I'm going to try a little more sharpening just to get a little more definition. So I'm going to go to my background again, duplicate layer, and I'm going to use an overlay blending mode. Go to filter, other, high pass, and we want to use a small value. So looks about 2 pixels. I'm starting to see some definition here. 4 pixels and I see a lot more definition, but I don't want it to be too much. That looks okay. Select OK. And I'm going to turn it on and off just so we can look at it. So here's off, here's on. That is way over sharpened, so I'm actually going to delete that layer. That was too much. So instead, maybe I'll try to duplicate layer again. This time, since the high pass sharpening was too much, I'll just try to smart sharpen it and see how that looks. I'm using 1 pixel and adjusting the percentage and just looking from there. Let's try that. This is on, off, off. It's very subtle. I like subtle. I'm going to blend it 80%. Select both layers and merge. That looks okay to me. The last thing I might do is one more levels adjustment on only the background layer. So I'm going to disable the prominence layer, make a background levels adjustment, and here's my histogram, and I want to just drag the middle a little bit to the right just to darken it and get some more contrast. And I'm going to drag in this just a little more on the right where the whites are. And let's see how that looks together when I enable my prominences. And I can turn it on and off to see how it affects it. So as you can see, it just adds a subtle bit of contrast everywhere else. I like that, so I'm actually going to keep all of this. To do my next part of editing, I'm going to color the image. So I'm going to go to select all, and I'm going to go to edit, copy, merged. This is going to take all the layers and merge them into one and then copy it. And now I'm going to paste that new layer, and notice it's everything in one layer. And I can disable my other layers and it doesn't matter. I now have one layer with all of the others in it, and I can work with that now as a single image. What I want to do next is actually a levels adjustment, and I want to see if I can take this white down just a little bit. So here on the levels adjustment screen, see this value? You can pull this to the left and drop the overall brightness on the whites without hurting your midtones or blacks. I feel all the way is a little too white. I like this subtle gray a little better. Nothing's blinding white anymore. I'm going to leave it there. I like that. And I'm going to merge that. Or actually, I'll just leave it alone. We'll just leave it there for now. The last thing I want to do is color it. I color a little differently. So to color this image, I'm actually going to make a levels adjustment curve. This time, to color with a levels adjustment, I'm going to select this drop-down box where it says RGB, and I'm going to go to just the red channel, and I'm going to change this middle value to 1.6. Notice it gets a little red pink. I'm going to go back to the drop-down box, go to green, and I'm going to change the middle value to 0.8. Now it's looking a little pinker, maybe a little purpley. Go back to my drop-down box, blue, and I'm going to change the middle value to 0.2, and now those three blend together to make a yellowy orange. Notice it colors everything, so the disk, the prominences, all the black space. I kept my glow, and I have the detail on the surface. We'll go ahead and take a look at what it looks like full screen. That looks okay. Out a little bit here. I like to just peek at everything. It's a little over sharpened maybe, but that's alright. But overall, we'll call this a final image. I could continue to tweak small things, but I think this gives you the idea. So we'll call it done, and I will simply save as, and I'll just call it a JPEG. So format JPEG, and we'll just call it our final image. Save it. And that's it. I'm going to close Photoshop. And we'll take a peek at our final image. So there we are. Start to finish, not a lot of editing in Photoshop. It's mostly just levels adjustments and sharpening with high pass filters. And that's it. I hope this really helps you to get started. And if you have any questions, you'll see me on the forums.